And welcome everybody. Pretty excited about talking about management of change today. We've been doing a lot of work with our clients, and we've got some experiences to share. We think this hopefully will inspire some new thinking about the processes and the technologies that you can apply to the practice of management of change. So I'm going to start, just because we're a software vendor, we'll start with that obligatory background for our company CoreWorks. And I know some of you may have worked with us before, so I'm going to be brief. But here's some points about our company. We're a leading software vendor focused on project information management. But in particular, we deliver solutions for larger capital projects, many of which are $1 billion plus in total installed value. And our big value is that we provide the project-centric features for document control, document management, and project collaboration. It's all about working with your contractors and suppliers and controlling the information. And we include many best practice automated workflows, automated business processes inside the box, and that'll help you manage the intensive business processes in a major project. Our customers are all over the world, fairly evenly divided between owners and contractors, but the industry is predominantly oil and gas, though we do have a number of power and mining projects that we're working on as well. So CoreWorks has developed and defined several projects based on years of project use, and we've been around long enough to recognize best practices in the industry, so we spend a lot of time transforming those practices into what we call our foundation processes that we include as templates inside the software. And our flagship product is called Project Information Control, and it's based on it's all about an information management system designed for projects, but it's very flexible, allowing you to configure it for managing revisions of all types of project information. It comes loaded with document control best practices in particular. Those are ones that are really refined for the intensive volume of documents exchanged on the larger projects. Things like transmittals, reviews, and approvals being part of that. And it's really, really effective at managing the relationships between the contracting parties. But in a nutshell, it's really designed so that the right people get the right information at the right time. And on the right side here, you can see the other products that we offer, some of which we'll be talking about today. They include change management, request for information, interface management, document deliverables management, and coming in next year is contract management. So our outline for today is we're going to start by talking about the way today's projects are managing change, and give you a bit of that level set on what we're seeing today, the strategies that they're applying, and how the practice is evolving in the areas of focus there. But the thrust of the presentation today is going to be about how people are applying information technology. In particular, we're going to look at the evolution of how the manual change processes have kind of worked their way into the contemporary software products and applications, and things like how they're using the software and the technology to provide better visibility to risk and stronger support for compliance. Those two aspects are of particular importance. So then I'm going to describe what we feel is today's best practice for managing change, which involves the use of an integrated business process to manage the relationships between all the influencers of change and all the things that are affected by change. So let's get started. So got a little picture of JFK here, and I wanted to use one of his quotes today to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about here. So in 1963, one of his addresses in Frankfurt, he used the line, "Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or the present are certain to miss the future." So what I'm really hearing him say here is to stop wondering about the if change is going to occur, and just immediately come to grips with the certainty of it, and stop focusing on the reaction to change, but instead to embrace it and plan for it. So I think that's kind of the messages I want everyone to take away, and we'll be reinforcing that with some of the technology discussion a bit later. So let's do a little bit of a background on the change processes around management of change, and just so everybody's on the same page here. To begin, let's recognize the variety of different reasons or sources of change in a major project. Most of us think about changes with a negative impact, such as those resulting from a deficiency in design or some non-conformance issue. But there's also positive changes, less frequent, but those resulting from value engineering or constructability reviews, things that are progressively improving the project, are also changes. But then there's also the changes that arise from the external project factors. These are like economic conditions or commodity prices, labor availability, things like that they can put pressure on the project, and it definitely will cause modifications to your approach for your execution. So those are the reasons for the change. We generally classify changes, and changes at the highest level are those scope or non-scope changes. Scope changes sometimes introduced by the owner, sometimes from unforeseen site conditions, things of that nature. Non-scope changes are kind of a mixed bag of commercial things. Maybe a process or a project document needs to change, or some kind of a budget transfer. So lots of different types of change are important to keep in mind. And then when we talk about the key steps of change processing, the pattern has remained the same for years. A potential change gets identified as early as possible, gets validated by the experts in the project team, and that's generally when the formal change process gets launched. And then the review process that ensues leads to approval or rejection by authorized individuals. And then approved changes are distributed as change notices, and everybody's notified to update the appropriate project information on all sides. That's the nuts and bolts of the change process itself. Change impacts are a really important part of this, and change impacts are usually measured by cost or time. If a change is approved with a cost impact, the project forecast gets updated. If a change is approved with a time impact, the schedule needs to be updated, potentially. And then some changes may just impact the project policies or other artifacts of the project. So then we talk about change thresholds. Most projects we work with have established and enforced minimum thresholds with regard to change impacts. That's because they want to avoid bogging down the project team with unnecessary paperwork around change management, or change processing can be time and people intensive. So this could be a cost impact threshold. Maybe like some examples are just as simple as, hey, if the cost impact value of a change is greater than $10,000, it needs to go to an extra level of approval, for example. Sometimes it could be measured in weeks with regard to schedule impacts, things of that nature. So the thresholds are an important part of the process. And then I've added forecasting to the slide because forecasting is an expected and essential part of the change process. Well, one of the main reasons we put the change process in place is to see how changes will affect the project plan. This helps us make decisions that affect the project outcomes. So forecasts are updated frequently, but not for every change, but usually some regular interval, weekly or monthly, to that effect. So here's the classic risk versus time picture. Most of us will be familiar with this. Maybe it's not the prettiest one you've seen because it was a bit hastily drawn out. But I put it here just to remind us that, as always, the greatest opportunity to control risk exists at the start or the earliest point in time. And your chance of affecting risk goes down as time goes by. So that's particularly relevant to change management. There's always a specific point in time when, and it's usually early on, when you can sense there's a leading indicator of change. You can detect that, you can capture it, report it. It might just be the possibility of emerging change due to some project issue, or maybe a correspondence that comes in that points to some confusion. These are all indicators that you can look at and determine at that time whether there's a risk there for change. If someone can identify and record it at that moment in time, then the project team, may be able to deal with it before it becomes a problem, and that's always the best way to manage change. We're seeing many of our clients record potential changes and implement a process that actually assigns someone to develop a risk mitigation plan for potential changes. So the reporting of potential changes, putting a mitigation plan in place right away is important to them. And I've heard some of the terms in the industry. The one that it keeps popping up is called a trend or a trends process, and that's how a set of potential changes can indicate upward or downward trends in the project. So great for risk managers or people just kind of overseeing that level of risk. And there's a lot of effort expended here, and certainly more than should be spent just on a change review or approval process. And that effort is spent just identifying the impact of the potential change and identifying that mitigation strategy. So early identification is everything. So let's talk about how major capital projects are changing. We certainly are seeing larger projects in general. Some of those projects we've been working with are $30 billion plus value. These are massive undertakings with at the level 3 you've got of your schedule you may have a dozen major scope packages with different contractors involved. Certainly a different contracting models and business structures in those large projects. Get some more joint ventures, you get partnerships, you get specialized contractors involved that need to do complicated things. So definitely the project's evolving that way. These large projects have a global market exposure, and that leads to volatility too. Sometimes you see different organizational designs in place now. It's different collaborative models too, but organizationally they might use practices such as concurrent engineering to manage shared design information. Interface management is a big one that we've been part of, really a hot topic in the market these days, and that one's emerging more and more because of these large and diverse sets of work that are awarded to different contractors at a very high level. And somebody's got to look out for the in-betweens there to catch the interfaces between those scope packages. And then you've got complex performance metrics, data requirements that are larger than what you've seen before, not tens of thousands of records anymore, it's hundreds of thousands and millions of records. And then these projects have to integrate a broader spectrum of functions and support services. So definitely you can't just use your traditional change policies or change processes in these environments. You got to start thinking about a little bigger scale, and some of these complex factors come into play. So that's where we see some of the practices change, and this slide kind of talks about how things are shifting from certain traditional practices into more evolving practices. I found this one from a document from Information Age Publishing, and it describes the industry's view of change management and how it's shifted. So people used to care more about getting changes approved and executed quickly. It was all about the efficiency. And now there's an emphasis on a more effective process that cares more about quality, continuous improvement, that type of thing. And it used to be deemed a success to have a database of changes, just to archive all the documents and decisions. But now the data that's being collected is actually being used to support decisions, and that's the way more effective way of doing things. It used to be that managers were more concerned about controlling projects directly, but now they expect the project teams to do that themselves, to make the independent decisions on things. And that includes giving them the ability to orchestrate change management. And then it used to always be about excellence in executing projects. But now the management looks at not from a project-centric view. They're looking across the entire programs, across their enterprise. So now they're putting in as much enforcement, or call it standardization and compliance rules, around projects across their entire organization. So the one that I find the most intriguing is instead of focusing on each work process in isolation, such as the change reviews, organizations now look at how these processes interact with each other. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. So let's talk about what's happening with IT and change management. Some of you may have seen this one before, especially if you work with CoreWorks, but we call it the information mountain. And it's really showing the growth and volume of asset information to begin with. Once you hit that EPC stage, you see that ramp of asset information increasing fairly quickly. But really, if I build the slide here, you see how it's dwarfed by this mountain of information that's about, we call it execution and compliance information. And that's all those things that aren't directly related to the installed equipment or the physical installed pieces of the facility there. This is all things like correspondence and commercial documentation. It could be any kind of additional information that gets tracked, like compliance information. So it's pretty steep. You see the growth curve there. In fact, it's almost incredibly steep. But what that's really saying is that if you got to the stage of your planning stage and you're in FEED or you're in the late stages of planning, you do not have a way to be ready and to address this huge ramp of information, you're in big trouble, because you need to have those tools in place before it begins. So so that's really the message that we talk about with CoreWorks, is that to be ready for that information glut, and that includes not just being able to manage documents, but to manage the processes that are going to be starting to spring up everywhere. So then, getting back to IT for management of change, you can see that there's most of you have probably made the move from spreadsheets to information management systems at some point, usually through a web browser in a web-based format, sometime in maybe the past 10 or 15 years. And now the focus is on building automated work processes that take those managed information to actually get work done, and on supporting collaboration between the parties to ensure smooth transfer of information and make sure everybody's got their responsibilities well understood and who's doing what. So, but the big one is pulling the value of the information to make business decisions. We call that business intelligence often. So it's great to have the documents at the right time, but how do you actually determine your project's progress, for example? How do you determine the forecast for when the project will be complete? Answering those questions is, often you've got the information sitting there in your information management system, but you need to pull it out and make it useful. So that's where we're seeing IT evolve to help you. And then when we talk about how IT has actually helped or impacted the management of change process, we really kind of divide it into three big areas: visibility, compliance, and efficiency. And each project may determine which is most important, but we generally find that the first two are often cited as the priorities for our clients on most projects. The visibility is all about the timely distribution of change information to the project stakeholders. And you can see some of the methods there that technology can help you with, getting stuff to people in real time, using dashboards and data warehouses and introspecting the content to find things that are profiled in certain ways with risk or with dates that need to be attended to. So visibility is a big thing. When we say compliance, we're talking about making sure the organization's policies are strictly followed and consistently executed. So this is where technology really goes a long way to help out, because it can lock in the compliance on your project to use things like checks and balances, validating data as it goes into the system. It can use workflows that strictly enforce the sequences of work and who's authorized to approve something. so it really helps with the compliance aspects. And then I'm sure most of us have tried to apply technology to improve efficiency. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, but certainly there's enough advantage there to say that you can expedite work, you can identify work that's lagging and act upon it to make it top of the queue. You can you just get the technology to help you with work timing. So what's the duration of this step, and how can we enforce that and escalate things as required. So great things can be done with technology to help the management of change. So now I want to talk about how the tools have evolved to meet the needs of an integrated program, and we say business process integration is a way to describe that. And, I know some people might not be too familiar with that term, so I'll spend a few minutes to describe what I mean by that. So just to do a recap, there's a term you may have heard in the industry when it talks about software and technology. It's called business process management, and boil it down, really it starts, or it usually is anchored by a workflow system or a workflow management system. And workflows are really automated processes. They're designed to deliver work items in a defined sequence to people or to a machine for processing. And they also are intelligent sometimes to be able to make decisions based on conditions or what data has been submitted at what stage in the process. So when you look at the business process management aspects, there's the people who execute the business process, and generally those are project team members, subject matter experts. Often you'll have your suppliers or contractors engaged directly in a workflow. You've got your management, you've got authorities who are approving things. These people will use tools like electronic forms to enter data, or other tools to execute the work. So technology really brings that front and center to their desktop and gives them the tools to act on it. And then there's the group of people who monitor the process, the controllers, so to speak, who they're using reports, dashboards, they're identifying those delays, they're expediting work. They're doing forecasts, things of that nature to give the business the ability to be more efficient and to do those checks on compliance. So that's business process management. Now, if we talk about management of change, this is my bubble slide, but this is meant to try to give you an impression of the large amount of processes, the discrete processes that are involved in management of change. It's certainly not generally viewed as a single process. There's a lot of things that kind of affect change, a lot of things that are affected by change. So this talks about some of those things. In particular, if you see change management in the middle, and you kind of think of the desire to have one change management system. Often people visualize that by having the single change register or the change log that you see all of the changes of the project in one place. That's really an important aspect of this. But if I look at the green bubbles, those are the ones that are representing a lot of the processes that are common in large projects. But the outputs from those processes can directly affect changes. So we call those affecting processes. And then I guess the most common example would be the RFI. There you see. Simple questions can be raised by a contractor, but it can often identify the need for a major change. So they're a particular discrete process that should be part of an integrated change management of change program. If you look at the red bubbles, they're representing processes that are affected by change. So each of these ones depend on change data. So if you're trying to accurately communicate or control project information, such as like a forecast, you need to bring that change data from the change management program into the forecast. Make sure it's representing not only the original but the change value of your forecast. And the purple bubbles represent processes that can affect but also be affected by change. So Even more than the others, those processes are going to demand an integrated approach to managing change. I'll give you some examples in a bit so you can kind of see how that integration would look. Oh, my animation's a bit delayed there. Sorry, we'll keep going here. So let's examine how an integrated workflow system or a business process management system can help. This example is a request for information from the job site. I think it's a simple technical question about operating a piece of equipment. So the RFI uses a workflow. A lot of the projects we work with have an automated process for RFIs. So they're using a workflow to manage the response by a subject matter expert. So it's actually allowing the expert to get directed this question, the appropriate expert anyways, and then that expert gets a chance to spot if there's a potential change. And if that expert sees that opportunity, then he can act on it immediately by launching an associated process called a potential change alert, as an example. So that can kick off a workflow automatically. It can populate or transfer the data between the processes. A very valuable part of a management and change program is to be able to transfer information from one part of the process to the next. But then once you've done that, you kind of look at the value of an integrated system. If you've got a project information management system, like a document management system or a database that controls all of the data, you can record the relationship between the RFI and the potential change alert. So here's an example of one. This is the CoWorks document management system recording a relationship between what we're viewing here, which is actually an engineering document, gets a relationship recorded to the change request. It's a simple example, but in the case we saw earlier, it could be the RFI and the change request or an RFI and a potential change alert, get that relationship recorded in the database. So once you've got those relationships captured, the organization gets an advantage because they can clearly see, in this particular, or the RFI example, which RFIs represent a risk of change. They can also kind of trace the change back to its origin, the RFI, and that's very, very valuable for compliance or potential claims or disputes in the future if you're doing that kind of discovery. So let's look at some other data relationships here. So data, obviously your change processes are going to generate data, and this data that you're generating, as actual materially valued to the project. So you need integration to the other systems. So in this instance, I'm showing an approved change request that has schedule impact values, cost impact value. So transferring this data to an integrated scheduling system or cost management system gives you the ability to dynamically update a forecast or rebaseline a schedule as required. So it's very important that your change management processes have the ability to move the data into these integrated systems. So let's look at kind of an end-to-end integrated example. Started the example with that RFI example. Construction contractor raises the RFI, has I guess what seems to be a simple question. Then that RFI can trigger a potential change alert. A coordinator or a subject matter expert maybe determines that a potential change should be raised around this issue that's been evidenced by the request. And in turn, that potential change gets routed to somebody who's doing an impact assessment. So is this a real impact to our project? Well, that impact assessment might actually be related to an interface between scope packages, interface management being that discipline of identifying when something's kind of fallen in between two major contractor scopes of work. So now there's an interface impact. Well, somebody's going to, if they've got an integrated interface management process, they can now maybe identify that there's a change to an interface agreement. Well, sometimes a change to an interface agreement, just like any other artifact that gets changed in the project, can also have an impact. And in this case, the interface agreement is showing that there's going to be a delay in the schedule or schedule impact. So just keep following this through. Ultimately, you've got a schedule impact. Well, your schedule and forecast needs to be updated. In many cases, that might not occur immediately, but certainly providing notification to the scheduler or the planner or the project controls person to update those artifacts is important, so that everybody gets on the same page about what's happening with this change. So ultimately, we think that I guess the point of all this is that you see that there's an integrated set of processes, that they're exchanging information, they're building that relationships between them, and with that great historical database and using technology to provide that, you've got a full set of tools now to mitigate risk, because these processes are going to speak to each other, they're going to record the data effectively, and you're going to get a chance as early as possible to link those potential changes into other business processes that are important to your company. So I went through that pretty quickly, but let me do a quick summary for you, and then I think we'll have some time for questions. So first I started talking about how we're managing change in today's projects. So we kind of outlined how management of change needs to be a comprehensive program. And then we talked a little bit about how the practices, how project environments have changed, how projects are different, and then how the practices have changed in response. So definitely requiring a more dynamic and integrated approach. So then we talked about IT and technology, in particular applications for management of change, kind of how they've evolved past the basic request response or coordination, and have evolved into managing collaboration, business intelligence for extracting, data and value for decision support. And finally, I talked about that whole business process integration capabilities that are so important for management of change. And I showed you my bubble slide. We talked about how change is an integrated process. There's lots of inputs and outputs. You don't want to kind of lose the connection between the systems, or you might lose the opportunities to mitigate risk. So that's a quick summary of what we've talked about today. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask our moderator to identify if there's been any questions on the chat panel. If you certainly have questions now, you can ask them on the chat panel, and so let's have a look and see if we've got any questions.
I have a question, Joel. Can I run a report that compares several contractors at once?
Okay, the question was, can I run a report that compares several contractors at once? I'm assuming that's related to how many contractors have initiated changes, or okay. So yeah, no, I think that's a good question. Part of management of change system is being able to identify risk around your contractors and the people you're working with. So definitely, at least in CoWorks, we do have features to allow you to run contractor-based reports to say, okay, who's raised the most RFIs in this time period, who's late on responses to change approvals, that type of thing, and different parties can be reported on that way. So you can keep a close eye. You can do things like performance assessments to keep historical information about who the contractors were that were performing well and who were not performing well. So that's a good question. Thank you very much.
There's another one. Could change be managed by effective interface management?
That's a great question. So the question was, could change be managed by effective interface management? So certainly, if interface management was one of those purple bubbles, those are one of those interchangeable processes that need that can provide inputs to change, also can be affected by change. So if you're managing your interfaces well, generally you can identify early on whether these interfaces are going to affect change. A lot of people that we've worked with, they actually track schedule information with interfaces, so they can see when the interfaces are committed in terms of completion. They can identify if there's a change needed for an interface. They can run a change request process directly on the interface. And ultimately, if that interface is going to affect schedule, that change in the interface affects schedule, there's things like schedule integration that the technology can provide to automatically update or notify your schedulers of that change. So definitely that's a big part of managing change. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there, but I've got some closing comments here.
Hi, Peter Walker again. Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you to those in the audience that asked questions. Of course, if you have any further questions, feel free to add them to the chat, and we'll summarize and respond to the group. And again, thank you, Joel, for bringing us up to speed on how management of change in capital projects can be improved with an integrated system. Certainly a hot topic for many project professionals today who are looking for better and more proactive ways to manage change on their projects. For anyone interested in further information on any of today's topics or other solutions that CoreWorks provides, we have on the screen a list of contacts in various regions of the world. And in terms of additional content and webinars that we believe of interest to the community, we have 3 more events coming up around the topics of interface management, combining interface change and risk management and the relationships between them, and looking at interface management and document control and how to better bring those 2 disciplines together. So once again, thank you, Joel. Thank you for those in the audience with questions, and have a good day, and we hope to see you at one of our upcoming events and webinars. Thank you.